Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Bits and Pieces, a series just for you Visual Studio subscribers. Now, I want to thank you for joining in today. And I am your host, April Edwards, and I'm a developer and I work for GitHub. And just like you, I want to know what tools I can use to help me develop applications more effectively. So I want to introduce my guest today, Aaron Mast. Hey, Aaron, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. Could you please introduce yourself to everyone out there that may have not met you, even though they probably should have?
So I've been at Microsoft and the developer division for about 18 years. I was here when we were called MSDN subscriptions. Now we're called Visual Studio subscriptions. Yep. We own the my.visualstudio.com portal and the managevisualstudio.com portal. And my specialty is primarily on special benefits, Azure credits, Azure DevOps access, and in this case, GitHub Enterprise access.
Awesome. So what are we going to really be talking about today?
So we want to dig into this new bundle. Ever since we rebranded to Visual Studio subscriptions, we've been shipping with what is now called Azure DevOps. And so what we want to do is dig a little bit more into after the GitHub acquisition, this bundle that we've created where you get, like Azure DevOps, you get a GitHub Enterprise license along with your Visual Studio subscription. So for no additional cost, enterprises are switching to this bundle subscription. The vast majority of them have made that switch at this point. So we want to make sure we reach out to subscribers and make sure they're aware that they have this benefit and how they can get involved.
Awesome. And in terms of subscriptions, do you want me to go ahead and bring up my screen to the portal and we can kind of go through what each of them are, what they mean, and how we access our GitHub benefits?
Right. So if we go to the my.visualstudio.com page here, you can see this is the portal that most people are going to access their downloads and their benefits. If we go to this drop down where it says subscription, you'll see a variety of different options in here. So there are different subscription levels. If you have one that says with GitHub Enterprise, like this one we have selected, you've got that bundle. And if you have the bundle, just below here in this top row of benefits, you'll see a tile that says GitHub Enterprise. You can click the Learn More button to learn more, and it'll actually give you some status about where you are in the process of getting set up.
Perfect. And I think
so if you can help me out, help me understand what is GitHub Enterprise and what do you get with it?
So absolutely. And I think you're right. There's a lot to learn about what GitHub Enterprise is, and there's a lot of questions about what that includes. And I think, the way to best think of it is GitHub isn't what our parents' GitHub. GitHub came about in 2008. It was a source code repository. And while it was fantastic, it just held source code. And it was it still is the largest developer platform in the world with over 100 million developers consuming it. But most people don't know about GitHub Enterprise and all the things it includes. So I think first and foremost, we talk about it as an open source platform, but we use it for collaboration and inner sourcing within organizations. And with that comes access, right? So how do we access GitHub? How do we use our accounts? How do you hook in your Microsoft account or the account you're using in your Visual Studio subscription into GitHub? And then maybe for open source projects. And there's a huge number of organizations consuming open source software out in the world today in their own applications. But then we need to go further, not just consuming and accessing, but how do we plan our projects? How do we get ready to write code? How do we organize our teams and work in agile ways? We have a full project planning suite with GitHub Projects, which is included and is free with GitHub Enterprise and a GitHub account. And then we also have things like private packaging for containers and a container registry. So if you have maybe an NPM or Maven package, that's all included as well. Now that is based on data consumption, but we do have that capability for you to host these things. And these things are also available to host in Azure. And if anyone's using Azure DevOps, it's a very similar concept as well. So it's very, very similar, just on a different platform. But then, we want to secure everything by design from day one. How do we authenticate? How do we access things? And GitHub Enterprise enables a little bit more of a step up in terms of authentication, whether using SAML and SSO, but then also things like security. And we're going to take a deep dive into security in a minute, because as a developer, as we're writing code, we need to be secure from day zero. And that's really important. But also, how do we develop? What kind of automation tools do we have at hand? And we're going to actually look at some tools in a minute. Like we're going to look at GitHub Actions, which are amazing because they can literally automate anything. So I think if for anyone that's using Azure DevOps, the Azure pipelines is pure CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. But we need to always automate more within our repositories and in our code bases, and Actions can literally automate anything. So we're going to take a look at some of the things we can automate with an action and how they're triggered. The other thing is development environment. So a lot of people watching are Visual Studio subscribers, but we're going to talk about GitHub Codespaces and some of the advantages those bring, because there is an allowance for Codespaces when you use GitHub Enterprise. And then also, things like GitHub Copilot. Now, GitHub Copilot is an add-on. We are going to talk about it a little bit because everyone wants to know about AI. But if you're a student, it is free. But if you're not, if you're an enterprise or an individual, there is a fee associated to it, but it is part of the GitHub Enterprise platform, and that platform is continuously expanding every day. So you ready to go see it?
Yeah, but before we actually look at each individual feature, I think we have to do the most exciting part of this, which is licensing. So yes. if we want to switch back to the My Portal, if you follow that tile through, there's a page that'll actually show you the setup process here. So if we scroll down a little bit, we'll look at the couple of the screenshots. Yeah, so these different screenshots of the tile that you get in your My Portal show you where your company is in the process of setting everything up so that you can get access to GitHub Enterprise. Unlike some of our other benefits like Azure credits and things of that nature, this benefit has to be set up and you must receive an invite from a GitHub admin in order to avail the benefit, essentially. So the subscriber isn't in complete control of when they get access, but the tile will tell you where your company is in the process of getting you access. So if it says it's pending enterprise account setup, then your company's still identifying who that GitHub Enterprise account admin should be and getting those resources set up on the GitHub side. If it says it's pending an invite, then it's set up and we're just waiting for an admin on the GitHub side to send you an invite to an org. And once you are attached to that org, if you accept the invite, then you have full access and you can begin going to github.com and using the benefit.
So basically, we need to go tap on someone's shoulder to get access.
Yeah, if you know who your GitHub Enterprise admin is, definitely tap them on the shoulder and request access for sure. Cool. Perfect. Fun part done.
All right.
From here.
All right. Let's go actually see some GitHub in action. You ready?
Yes, let's do it.
All right. So I have a repository for us that I've built out. Now, Aaron, as a developer, when we're getting started writing code, I find that it's often hard getting started on a new project. We're waiting for permissions. Like we just talked about getting access to GitHub Enterprise in general. Like we got to wait for access. And that is the most frustrating part of being a developer. So we have our access. We're in the portal. We're ready to go and write some code. Now, I'm looking at this code base. How do you normally get started when you're joining a new project and a new code base?
We're try to get access to code and get get into the flow as quickly as possible, ideally.
Yeah, and traditionally we would clone our code. So we'd go to the code button at the top, clone our code here, and bring that down to our machine. Now, I talked about security starting at day 0 for developers, and also getting started is tough because you could have a really, really large repository with a lot of code in it, especially legacy code, and it could take a while to clone. But then also, like, I have multiple machines. I have a Windows device in front of me. I've got a Mac on the other side of me over here. I've got a couple other devices in my office. So when I want to write code, getting started is really tough because I got to set up every machine. I got to install my dependencies, NPM packages, versioning. I need access to everything. That's tough, and that takes a long time. So instead of cloning our code, I want to show you a GitHub Codespace. Now, we have options of how we set up a GitHub Codespace. We can send everyone documentation of how to do this, but it's really simple. We create a Codespace off of our main branch. Now, this is spinning up a containerized environment in the cloud. This is actually hosted on Azure, and it's using compute in the cloud. So sometimes when we're running tests locally on our machine in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, it heaves our machine because our machine's out of compute. So in this case, it's giving me a standardized set of compute. And if I run out of compute, I can actually up my compute. But it's a containerized environment running off an image, a container image, and it gives each of my developers in my team an identical development environment. If we have maybe the C# dev kit that we need to run with our code because we're coding in C#, we can include that in what's called a dev container. And that builds this image for this container and tells the code space exactly what it needs to run. So this is great. This is a secure development environment. It's lightweight and it runs runs from your browser. So Aaron, we were able to set this code space pretty quickly. I'm going to go ahead and make it a little bit bigger for all of us, as you know, we're trying to watch all these things remotely. So we've set up, this is all of our code in our repository that we have access to in this containerized environment and have all of my extensions. So if you code in VS Code, you can actually sync your settings from Visual Studio Code to your GitHub code space. The other cool thing about this is down here, if I click on the code spaces, I can actually open this in Visual Studio Desktop. And that means I don't have to run this from the cloud and I still don't have to clone my code. I can literally open up in Visual Studio Code locally without actually pulling down my code. So yes, I still have to kind of talk to the cloud and all that good stuff. Now, as I'm in this code space, we can start writing our code and we're ready to go. And that was so much faster and easier. I don't need to install any packages because they're all ready to go. They're all contained in this dev container file. It tells exactly what I need to get started in this project. So we're good to go. We have everything pre-baked. We probably need to think about the next thing we need to do as a developer. Oh, and I just want to mention about Codespaces, by the way. You get 120 hours of compute a month that is included for free with GitHub Enterprise. And if you do need to go over that allocation, you can set up a blocker so you don't overbill. But you get 120 hours of coding capability out of a Codespace. So it's a free component in addition to your GitHub Enterprise benefit as well. So that's really cool. So security. Security is really important. Have you ever put a password in your code?
I can neither confirm nor deny that I've been caught by a scanning tool for that.
Well, if you got caught by a scanning tool, that's better than it getting found in production and having a breach in your environment. And I think we've all been there. It scared us. It's not great. One thing that is also involved, part of GitHub Enterprise is GitHub Advanced Security. Now, if you are using a public repository, these tools are free. We are working in a private repository right now, so there is a paid for service on that. But if you're coding in a public repository, it is a free thing you can enable. You just need to go down to the security tab, select some things, and you have some option to you literally click enable. So code security and analysis, all this is already enabled for us. So we can enable Dependabot, and I'll go over that in a second. We can look at GitHub Advanced Security, which is already enabled for us. We have code scanning, and we have the ability to do push protection and secret scanning. So these are three really big areas as a developer that helps us write better code and more secure code. So these are all enabled. And actually, I've maybe potentially put some security vulnerabilities in for us to look at how this works. So when we enable the security settings in a public repo that are free, it will scan your code for any dependencies. Now, managing dependencies is really hard as a developer because you've embedded all these open source projects and all these other code bases, and you don't always know what's valid, and it's hard to keep up to date. And actually here with Dependabot, it scans our dependencies and tells us when there's an alert. So in this instance, we have some high, it also tags it high, medium, or low. And I'm just going to click on the high dependency that it's found here. It tells us where it's found it tells us what the package is. It tells us what versions are affected and what the patch version is. So we need to patch this dependency that we have running in our code base. I can review the security update, and it gives me the CWE tag on it so I can look it up. It gives me some kind of proof of concept and some data in here and some other analysis. And actually, it's fixed it by a pull request. It's already opened up a pull request for me. I can select that, go to the pull request, see the fix, and I can accept it or decline it. So it's already fixed that dependency without me as a developer having to put in that effort. So
Nice.
That's really cool. Yeah, I think that's great because we consume so many great packages, so many great open source packages, but keeping up to date is so hard. Now, code scanning. This is another good one that also puts a tag on things. So we're just going to go ahead and look at a package here that's been flagged as critical. It tells us what branch it's on. It tells us exactly what the vulnerability is. It references it for us, and I can go down and see all the details of it. And actually from here, I can create an issue, and then I can address it later. And that issue puts it into a project or a board, if you will, and we can kind of backlog it, et cetera. So we can look at these vulnerabilities that's already in our code. So we've already pushed this code up, but we want to look at how we can prevent ourselves from pushing insecure code up, maybe secret. So let's say, for instance, Aaron, you would never do this. You're coding in Visual Studio Code or a GitHub Codespace or even Visual Studio, and you put a secret in your code.
Never.
Now, yeah, well, someone has put a Google API key in our code here. It's pulled it up, gives us remediation steps, and it tells us the location of that. The other thing that's enabled on this is push protection. So certain types of secrets, especially Azure secrets, specific ones like connection strings, some of the logging capabilities will pull up that secret and prevent you from even pushing that up. So it's, again, we're trying to help the developer write more secure code. So this is the security insights that we see. And this is great. This gives us a full pane of glass. Again, public repos, all free to get going. Now, we've given ourselves a development environment that is pretty good, right? We have a pretty good Visual Studio Code experience in the cloud. We have security settings configured. We can do that. I like to automate things. Do you like to automate things, Aaron?
Whenever possible.
And I think, you know what, I talked about it a little bit when we talked about the GitHub Enterprise benefits. GitHub Actions are amazing because I love being able to use CI/CD to deploy my code to the cloud and make it pretty seamless. I put a lot of tests in my CI/CD, but I need to automate other things. So in this repository, we have GitHub Actions, and each of these actions is in a workflow. And there are quite a few workflows here. So I'm just going to give you an example. We're going to deploy an environment to Azure, and we have a workflow that does this for us. And if I select the workflow in the browser experience, I can see we've given it a name. We're going to deploy it to Azure. Now this one's triggered, and this is really important. All actions are triggered. So this workflow is done by a couple of different mechanisms. It can be just anytime you make a code change. It can do on a pull request. This one's making a deployment type and maybe a change in the environment name or any change in the environment. So very specific ones. We can also do them on timers. So if maybe you have a task you want to do every day, maybe check your Azure subscription for, orphaned resources, or you're trying to run some PowerShell to automate some things, you can run that as a scheduled task every day, which is really cool. We can also see here that we do some code scanning. So when we enabled all these security features, this enabled some code scanning. And this is on every push of our code and every pull request. And those are the triggers for that one. And this does the code QL scanning, where our code is treated as data. And that's how it found the secrets in our code. So anytime we make a change to our code base, it's reading our code, finding those vulnerabilities, and reporting back. So we have those checks and balances in our code, which is really important. The other thing, I promise you something really cool. This is one of my favorite actions workflows. I run this in a lot of my repositories. So when we're deploying stuff to Azure, what's something we often forget to do?
Shut down resources.
And then we incur a cost. So let's say you and I are using our Visual Studio subscription license, and we're using kind of the free dev test resources in Azure, and we spin some stuff up, and that's great. But maybe we've deployed some things that incur a little bit of a cost or a dev environment. We're going to keep incurring that cost, but being able to automate our way out of that cost is really cool. So this actions workflow here cleans up our environment that we deploy to Azure. So whenever I close a pull request with my code, I go and look into Azure and go, right, I have deployed something, and that test or dev environment gets taken down, any kind of inactive environment. So for me, this is one of my favorite actions workflows to run because it helps me clean things up. There's all sorts of great things in here as well. Like anytime you initialize a GitHub repository, we have an actions workflow here that does some cool things around. This one will bootstrap some stuff every time you join a repository and automate things across your repository. So there's so many things you can automate. It's not just CI/CD, and that's why I love actions. Now, I want to show you an Easter egg. Okay, so we just talked about deploying things into Azure and how they can sometimes incur a cost. I like doing things in a very cost-effective way or free way. Where's one of your favorite places to deploy a website to in Azure?
It's usually an Azure web app.
And Azure web apps are solid. I've been using them for years. And actually, they're great, but they do incur a cost, even on like the dev test capabilities with Azure and using your Visual Studio subscription. Azure static web apps are fantastic because, again, they're free of charge. So we can host a static site in Azure on the kind of that basic tier for free. But we also have this capability within GitHub. So you ready to see it?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So again, this is included with your GitHub Enterprise subscription. If I go to the settings here at the top, select that. We go down, there's a tab here called Pages. I go ahead and select Pages. Now, GitHub Pages are effectively a website hosted from GitHub that are included and include some automation. Again, all free of charge, which is so cool. So you can choose if you want this to be a private or a public site. Now, GitHub Pages do need to be a public repository that you're spinning this out from. So just kind of be aware of that. But what's really cool is you can build and deploy this website, and it gives you GitHub Actions in which to do this from. So in our case, I'm going to use a static site. I'm going to go ahead and configure, and let's spin up a GitHub page. So as soon as I do this, it actually creates a GitHub Actions workflow for me to deploy our static site. It gives it a name, deploy static site to pages. It's going to take the index.html file we already have embedded. It sets up my read-write tokens. It literally sets up everything I need to do to deploy this site. I don't have to do anything else. It's pre-baked. I'm going to go ahead and commit the changes. I'm going to go ahead. I probably should do it as a branch, but let's create a branch. All right, Aaron. So we've set up a GitHub Pages site. We used our static site. We used our index.html file, and it gave us a GitHub Actions workflow to run from. So we didn't have to configure anything, which was really easy. And we can see our site is live here, and we can also bring in a custom domain. So maybe you want to have, aaronmass.com or Aaron is the best at, wherever. You can absolutely configure that custom domain on top of that, but your site's deployed. And anytime you make changes, you will run that Actions workflow, and it's already set up. And that only took, a minute or so to configure. So that was really easy. And that's also included as part of the GitHub Enterprise platform. So Aaron, we've talked about some really cool features with GitHub Enterprise. So we've kind of gone through how pull requests work, some of the security features, GitHub Pages, GitHub Actions. What else do you want to see with GitHub Enterprise?
It's really interesting too, and thank you, because we mostly use Azure DevOps in the product groups. So it's really interesting to see the features that are on the GitHub Enterprise side. When I'm working with the folks in the product groups, we're trying to stay in IDE as much as possible. So I'd be really interested to see what is this experience like when you're in the IDE?
Absolutely. And I think we've made that really seamless into Visual Studio into VS Code, Codespaces, and Visual Studio. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up Visual Studio here. Now, we have Visual Studio open and running. This is actually the same project I've pulled down. I'll be honest, previously cloned the code just in case it took a bit of time, got some packages and some dependencies installed, and I have my code open to a file. So we want to give it a pretty seamless experience because context switching is hard. I'll admit it, as soon as I leave my IDE and I go off to use my favorite search engine or go to Stack Overflow and look up a question, I'm lost, I'm gone, right? I'm off looking at holidays, I'm deciding to go make a cup of coffee, walk the dog, whatever. The context switching is tough. And I think the reality is we're in meetings and we're waiting on compute a lot, we're waiting on others. So the time we actually get to write code is so valuable as a developer. So we have made this experience in Visual Studio much better for you as a developer. Now we have our code on the left, and on the right-hand side, I've pulled up GitHub Copilot Chat. Now GitHub Copilot Chat is your AI pair programmer in the IDE. So if I go down on the left-hand side, and I do apologize, it is a little bit small, we can see that the GitHub Copilot icon is in fact enabled in this code base and in my IDE. Now I can go into my code, I can ask it to make suggestions straight from my code base. Now, GitHub Copilot, unfortunately, is not free. It is part of GitHub Enterprise, but it's not free. If you are a student, it is free. But more than likely, if you're watching this video and you're under enterprise licensing, it's not going to be free, unfortunately. But we have launched some new products out with it, and they are trying to look at how the licensing works, and that is totally outside my remit. But yes, unfortunately, it is an extra cost. So the Copilot feature is an extra benefit. And then the Copilot Chat, which is built into the IDE, also an extra cost. But let's go into what isn't an extra cost. Now we have the GitHub Actions extension in Visual Studio 2022. And remember I showed you all those actions before where we were working and doing things. Now I am working from my main branch. And from my main branch, I can see the actions workflows that have ran, which is really cool. So we deployed our environment a little while ago. I can see all the steps that took place and all the tasks that went through, and I can select those and go, right, I validated my deployment parameters. I set up the job. I authenticated with container registry in Azure. I pulled my container and then I deployed to my environment. So I know each of the steps. So if I'm making a pull request within Visual Studio 2022, I can see the pull request and then I can see the actions workflows running at the time, which is really cool. I don't have to leave my IDE. So that's really cool. And again, this is an extension that's available at no charge. Next up, I can see all the workflow files we do have access to. So maybe we want to modify a workflow file. I can see all the ones we have. So remember I told you how we destroyed our Azure environment. That one's right here. Now, another good one. Now, we talked about the GitHub Advanced Security, but more importantly, when we're doing GitHub Advanced Security, when we're doing any kind of security, we often have put secrets in our code. Now, that's a hard one, right? Because sometimes we're in a rush and we're trying to do things, but having the ability here to see the GitHub secrets you've stored, you don't have to go into the browser. You can do it here from the extension. So I can see the repository secrets that I've claimed. So if I am maybe writing out some code and need to know which secret to call, I can do that really easily by seeing these. Now you cannot see the secret that is stored. You can never see the secret. GitHub can't see the secret, which is why it's our secret store. You can change and update or delete a secret, but you can't actually see the secret. And I've had people get quite upset about that, but I'm like, well, your developers don't need to see the secret. What they need to know is how to call the secret and what it's for. So you have that ability here to see this. Also, if you're using different environments, maybe, we just deployed a GitHub page. That's an environment here. We have production environment. We can set up different environments, dev, test, QA, prod. So we can see all our environments we're deploying to. We can see how we're doing CI/CD. We can see what we're automating, all those workflows, and what's running and where. We can also use the pull request extension and see all the pull requests and where they are and how many pull requests are potentially in the queue as well as we're writing our code. So we have put in, again, free capability with the extension in your ID experience in Visual Studio.
That's awesome, but it is a lot. If people want to go somewhere where they can get some help or learn a little bit more, what are the right places to go?
Go to docs.github.com. We have a ton of information. We have everything documented of how to access things, what's included in the licensing, because there are so many more features that we didn't include, and very more fine-tuned, fine-grained features. Again, GitHub projects, again, very similar to Azure boards for project tracking, task tracking, issue tracking. So all these things are included in GitHub Enterprise. So there's so much going on. It isn't the same GitHub that we built in 2008. The platform has massively grown, and it has that full end-to-end capability. So you can literally start from development from day zero all the way out into the cloud without incurring any cost. So it's pretty cool.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking us through the tour there.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Aaron, for joining today. And thank you all for joining on today's episode of Bits and Pieces.